Catherine de Medici's life began in a cradle of crisis. Born in Florence in 1519 to Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, Catherine was orphaned within weeks of her birth. Her mother died from puerperal fever, and her father succumbed shortly after, possibly to syphilis. The young girl, though, descended from two powerful families, the French Bourbons and the legendary Medici banking dynasty, became a political orphan amid the volatile politics of Renaissance Italy. Her status as a Medici, however, guaranteed that she would never be forgotten. The Medici were among the most influential patrons of Renaissance Europe, having produced popes, bankers, and rulers. Yet in the early 16th century, Florence was a city teetering between republicanism and Medici domination. After the 1527 revolt that expelled the Medici, Catherine, then only 8 years old, became a hostage of the anti-Medici Florentine Republic. Despite her youth, she was considered dangerous, more symbol than child. Her captors moved her from one convent to another, hoping to avoid an uprising in her name, while Pope Clement VII, her great-uncle, maneuvered for her release. This prolonged captivity shaped her deeply. Catherine's time in religious institutions introduced her to courtly etiquette and rigorous education, but also to the harsh realities of power and instability. When Florence finally fell to imperial forces in 1530 and the Medici were restored, Catherine emerged from political obscurity into strategic utility. Pope Clement, keen to secure Medici influence beyond Italy, arranged her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orleans, second son of French King Francis III. The match was more transactional than romantic. France saw the Medici alliance as a route to Italian influence and papal favor. The Medici saw it as a survival mechanism. Catherine brought a rich dowry and Medici prestige, but no obvious political leverage. Her husband Henry had little affection for her. He openly preferred his mistress Diane de Poitiers, who would dominate court life for much of his reign. At court, Catherine was sidelined, politely tolerated, but never truly included. For 10 years, she failed to produce an heir, placing her position in jeopardy. Whispers of annulment swirled, but Catherine's persistence and perhaps medical intervention eventually paid off. Between 1544 and 1556, she gave birth to 10 children, 7 of whom survived infancy. With each birth, her influence quietly expanded, cementing her value to the Valois dynasty. The death of Francis I in 1547 marked a turning point. Henry ascended as Henry II and Catherine became queen consort. Still, she remained in the background. Diane de Poitiers continued to wield courtly power, controlling patronage and access to the king. Catherine's role was confined largely to ceremonial duties and child-rearing, yet she observed carefully. She built alliances, quietly accumulated knowledge of court factionalism, and crucially positioned herself as the guardian of her children's futures. This patience paid dividends in 1559, when a jousting accident killed Henry II. His eldest son, Francis II, ascended the throne at just 15. Catherine, now Queen Mother, found herself in an unprecedented position. Though Francis had married Mary, Queen of Scots, and the powerful Guise family loomed over the young court, Catherine maneuvered herself into the Regency. It marked her emergence as a serious political actor. Her early experiences in Florence had prepared her well for the volatility of French court politics. Catherine understood the mechanics of fear, the value of appearances, and the necessity of compromise. She saw that France was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of rival noble houses all competing for influence, wealth, and religious supremacy. The Protestant Reformation had fragmented the kingdom ideologically. The Huguenots, French Calvinist Protestants, had grown in number and influence, challenging the Catholic order. France teetered on the edge of religious war. Catherine's first instinct was balance. She sought to mediate between Catholics and Huguenots, not out of religious tolerance but political necessity. She initiated colloquies, commissioned religious debates, and even entertained marriage alliances across confessional lines. But she quickly discovered the limits of moderation. Each act of conciliation emboldened the opposition. The Guise faction, fiercely Catholic, viewed her actions as weakness. The Huguenots, led by figures like Admiral Coligny, demanded further concessions. Catherine found herself trapped. Any gesture toward one side invited retaliation from the other. Her challenge grew worse with the death of Francis II in 1560. Charles IX, then only 10, became king. Catherine assumed the regency, officially ruling in his name. Her position was more powerful than ever, but also more precarious. The kingdom was sliding toward open conflict. Protestant nobles formed armed leagues. Catholic magnates responded in kind. Catherine had to prevent civil war while protecting the throne her children inherited. She deployed everything at her disposal, marriages, edicts, backroom deals, but the spiral had begun. Her upbringing had taught her that rulers did not enjoy the luxury of personal sentiment. As regent, Catherine acted not as a mother alone, but as a political operator. She tightened her grip on court bureaucracy, cultivated informants, and restored her Medici network across Europe. She also began consulting astrologers, alchemists, and physicians, evidence of both her intellectual curiosity and desperation to control a volatile realm through every possible means. This phase of her life saw a shift in her reputation. In her early years, she had been a passive outsider. Now she was increasingly viewed as a schemer, a poisoner, a foreign queen exerting unnatural influence over French affairs. Much of this was the product of misogyny and xenophobia, but not all. Catherine did employ ruthless tactics. She believed that fear was a tool of governance. Her legacy would be shaped less by her intentions than by the consequences of the choices she made to hold a fracturing kingdom together. The political world she entered as a powerless bride had transformed into a battlefield, and Catherine, having learned in the shadows of Florence and the margins of the French court, was now at the center of a gathering storm. The death of King Henry II in 1559 triggered a rapid and perilous succession crisis, forcing Catherine de Medici to evolve from sidelined queen consort into an active political force. Though her son Francis II took the throne, he was only 15, and deeply under the influence of his uncles from the House of Guise, one of the most powerful Catholic factions in France. Catherine, the Queen Mother, was initially marginalized once again, as the Guise brothers used their nephew's reign to advance their own political and religious agendas. Yet Francis II's reign proved short-lived. He died in 1560, likely of complications from an ear infection or an abscess in the brain. His sudden death thrust Catherine into the center of power. Her second son, Charles IX, was only 10 years old, too young to rule in his own right. Catherine acted swiftly to secure the regency, and by leveraging her position as queen mother and widow of the late king, she had herself confirmed as regent by the Estates General. This was no small feat. France, fragmented by factionalism and religious upheaval, was not guaranteed to accept a woman, and a foreign-born one at that, as the de facto ruler of the realm. Now, regent for a minor king, Catherine had to balance power among deeply hostile political factions. The French court had become a nexus of competing interests. Catholic hardliners led by the Guise family, moderate politiques who sought compromise, and ambitious Protestant nobles pushing for reform and recognition. Catherine initially pursued a path of moderation. Her aim was not ideological harmony, but political stability. She believed that preserving the Valois monarchy, her family's hold on power, required avoiding the eruption of civil war. She made several attempts to broker peace. The Edict of January 1562 granted limited toleration to Protestants, allowing them to worship outside city walls. This policy angered Catholics, especially the Guise family, who saw any concession to Protestantism as heresy. Tensions escalated dramatically when François, Duke of Guise, attacked a group of Protestants at worship in Vassy, killing dozens. This incident ignited the First War of Religion. Catherine's moderate posture was increasingly untenable. The kingdom descended into civil war, and Catherine found herself forced to alternate between conciliation and suppression. Her role became one of strategic adaptability. She attempted to play both sides against each other, offering gestures of reform to Huguenot leaders like Admiral Coligny, while assuring Catholic loyalists that the monarchy had not abandoned the true faith. But neither faction trusted her, and each suspected her of duplicity. Throughout the early wars of religion, Catherine relied heavily on diplomacy. She arranged politically strategic marriages, including the infamous 1570 engagement of her daughter, Margaret of Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a leading Protestant and future king of France. The union was intended to reconcile Catholics and Huguenots, and symbolized her hope for national unity. But many Catholics saw the marriage as a betrayal, while Protestants remained skeptical of her sincerity. As regent, Catherine's administrative talents came to the fore. She restructured parts of the court, revived royal finances, and kept the monarchy from collapsing under the weight of constant warfare. But her efforts earned her few allies. Catholic propagandists accused her of undermining the Church, while Protestant writers painted her as a Machiavellian manipulator, an image fueled by her Italian background and Medici name. This image was reinforced by her increasing reliance on espionage-coded correspondence and selective assassinations. Catherine built an elaborate network of informants and became known for her political pragmatism rather than idealism. Her Italian heritage in particular fueled rumors that she used poison and black magic accusations, rooted more in cultural prejudice than in substantiated fact, yet potent, in shaping her historical reputation. Her court became synonymous with intrigue. The so-called Flying Squadron, a group of beautiful and intelligent women in her entourage, were rumored to act as political agents, gathering intelligence through seduction and manipulation. Whether this group functioned in such a formalized way is unclear, but the perception alone added to the growing mystique and menace surrounding Catherine's regency. Despite her efforts, the Civil War proved intractable. France experienced repeated cycles of peace and violence, with temporary truces followed by fresh outbreaks of hostilities. Each war further weakened royal authority and deepened factional resentment. Catherine responded by consolidating power where she could, centralizing decision-making, reducing the autonomy of regional governors, and tightening control over the king's council. As Charles IX matured, he began to take more active part in governance, but he remained under his mother's influence. He lacked the decisiveness or charisma needed to heal France's divisions. Catherine's dominance at court was resented by many nobles who believed she wielded excessive influence over the young king. But in truth, she often found herself reacting to events rather than controlling them. The rapidly changing political and religious landscape made long-term planning nearly impossible. Increasingly, Catherine turned toward hardline measures. After years of fragile peace efforts and failed reconciliation, she began to consider more drastic solutions. Her patience was wearing thin, and the threat of losing control over the monarchy, and thus the fate of her children, loomed ever larger. The stage was set for the most controversial decision of her political life, the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Though it would not occur for several more years, the seeds were already being sown in this period of Catherine's regency. Her frustration with the limits of negotiation, her fear of Protestant ascendance, and her obsession with maintaining the throne at all costs would drive her to actions that would haunt her legacy permanently. But before that infamous event, Catherine continued to walk the razor's edge, employing marriage manipulation and occasional brutality to stave off the collapse of France's monarchy. Yet the longer the conflict dragged on, the more Catherine's position shifted from peacemaker to enabler of violence. In trying to save her dynasty, she was slowly becoming complicit in the very divisions she sought to suppress. The fragility of France during Catherine de Medici's regency reached a critical threshold in the early 1570s. Multiple wars of religion had left the kingdom economically strained, socially fragmented, and politically paralyzed. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, recognized that moderate compromise was no longer satisfying either faction. The Huguenots, empowered by international Protestant support, and French nobles like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, demanded increasing concessions. Meanwhile, radical Catholics, especially the Guise faction, viewed any tolerance as betrayal. Catherine stood between these blades, searching for a path that could preserve her family's crown in the face of growing threats from both sides. Her solution was both symbolic and dangerous: the arranged marriage of her Catholic daughter Margaret of Valois to Henry of Navarre, a prominent Huguenot prince and heir presumptive to the Bourbon line. The political logic was sound. The union could, in theory, unite the two major confessions under the banner of royal authority and open a fragile space for reconciliation. The wedding set for August 1572 in Paris brought thousands of Protestants to the Catholic capital, including Coligny and many of his military allies. But beneath the festive exterior, tensions seethed. Many Catholic nobles resented the spectacle of a Protestant marriage held in their stronghold. Parisians, already hostile toward Huguenots, regarded the influx of Protestant nobles as a direct provocation. Catherine, concerned about the reaction but committed to the strategy, worked to maintain calm. She saw in this marriage a final opportunity to stabilize France and to reassert the monarchy's central role. Yet the plan quickly unraveled. Just days after the wedding, Coligny was attacked in a failed assassination attempt. He survived, but the event triggered widespread panic among the Protestant contingent in Paris. Huguenot leaders suspected Catholic hardliners. Catholics suspected a preemptive Protestant coup. At the center of the storm stood Catherine, who feared that retaliation would lead to a Protestant uprising and civil war in the streets of Paris. In response, Catherine met with her son, King Charles IX. What transpired in that meeting remains contested. Some sources suggest she persuaded Charles that a targeted purge of Huguenot leadership was the only way to prevent a full-scale uprising. Others argue Charles initiated the plan himself, out of fear and frustration. Whatever the origin, the decision was made to eliminate the Huguenot elite while they were still in Paris, disorganized and vulnerable. On the night of August 23, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Eve, the plan was set in motion. Under royal orders, guards began targeting Protestant leaders. Admiral Coligny was one of the first killed, dragged from his bed, stabbed and thrown from a window. What followed, however, was not a controlled execution, but a wave of uncontrolled slaughter. The violence spread beyond the targeted noblemen to ordinary Huguenots throughout the city. Catholic mobs, fueled by religious hatred and the chaotic atmosphere, roamed the streets, murdering men, women, and children. The massacre lasted several days and spread to other cities, including Lyon, Rouen, and Bordeaux, where local officials, some acting under royal orders, others on their own, carried out similar purges. Contemporary estimates of the dead vary, ranging from $5,000 to $10,000, though some modern historians suggest the number may be even higher. The massacre shocked Europe. Protestant nations condemned it as a Catholic betrayal, while Catholic hardliners celebrated it as a divine cleansing. Catherine's exact role in the planning and execution of the massacre has been debated ever since. Some chronicles portray her as the architect of the killings, a cold strategist who viewed bloodshed as a political instrument. Others suggest she lost control of a plan that was never intended to spark widespread carnage. Most historians now agree that while Catherine may have supported the initial plan to eliminate the Huguenot leadership, she did not foresee the scale or brutality of the events that followed. Regardless of intent, the massacre permanently altered her legacy. Abroad, Protestant leaders vilified her, especially in England and the Dutch Republic, where pamphleteers painted her as a demonic figure. In France, the event emboldened the Catholic League while hardening Protestant resistance. Catherine's attempt to unify France through a marriage alliance had instead produced one of the bloodiest religious massacres in European history. In the wake of the massacre, Catherine worked to manage the fallout. She oversaw damage control, with foreign envoys issuing justifications that painted the event as a necessary reaction to a Huguenot conspiracy. She urged Charles IX to take responsibility, publicly emphasizing that the killings were royal decisions to preempt an insurrection. But this only deepened public unease. The image of a monarchy ordering the slaughter of its subjects undermined royal legitimacy and trust. Charles IX, who had never possessed a robust temperament, began to unravel mentally. He suffered from guilt nightmares and physical deterioration. His health declined steadily, and his relationship with his mother became increasingly strained. Catherine once again was left managing a fragile crown as her son drifted toward death. He died in 1574 at the age of 23, likely from tuberculosis, but in the view of many contemporaries, the psychological burden of the massacre had hastened his end. With Charles's death, Catherine's third son, Henry III, assumed the throne. Intelligent and politically savvy Henry was also deeply self-absorbed and inclined toward flamboyant displays of piety and pageantry. Catherine, though no longer regent, remained a dominant figure at court, advising Henry through letters and direct counsel. But her ability to dictate events had diminished. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had shifted the terms of political engagement. Moderate compromise seemed increasingly impossible. The kingdom was now fully entrenched in religious extremism and distrust. Catherine's own reputation, already shaped by misogyny, xenophobia, and religious tension, became inseparable from the image of state-sanctioned terror. Her Medici heritage, her penchant for behind-the-scenes influence, and her association with the massacre all fed the emerging myth of the Poison Queen, the Italian schemer, the wicked matriarch. The irony was that Catherine had always been a conservative at heart. She wanted to preserve, not destroy. But in attempting to maintain royal authority at all costs, she had accelerated the kingdom's descent into chaos. Her decision in 1572 would haunt not only her legacy, but the very monarchy she had tried so hard to defend. The death of Charles IX in 1574 ushered in the reign of Henry III, Catherine de Medici's third son, to wear the crown. At 23, Henry was more capable than his predecessor, but less politically grounded than his mother had hoped. His education in Poland, where he had briefly served as elected king before abdicating to assume the French throne, had exposed him to unfamiliar political systems and ideas of elective monarchy. Upon returning to France, he brought with him a style of rule that was both more theatrical and more aloof than his elder brothers. Catherine, though no longer officially regent, remained deeply involved in statecraft, advising Henry, moderating factions, and striving to keep the kingdom from breaking apart entirely. Yet the landscape she faced had irrevocably changed. The memory of the saint, Bartholomew's Day massacre, was still fresh and had left deep scars in the national psyche. Many Protestants had fled the kingdom or gone underground, while those who remained were increasingly militant. The massacre had failed to eradicate the Huguenot leadership. Figures like Henry of Navarre, who had been spared and later renounced Catholicism, rose in prominence as Protestant resistance became more organized and ideological. Meanwhile, the Catholic League, an ultra-conservative coalition centered around the House of Guise, gained momentum. For them, Catherine was suspect, too lenient with Protestants, too Italian, too pragmatic. Henry III, despite his Catholicism, was not ideologically rigid enough to satisfy the League. He continued to seek middle ground policies that avoided total civil war. But the more he tried to compromise, the more both sides viewed him as weak. Catherine, ever the mediator, tried to negotiate with all factions, but each round of diplomacy yielded fewer results. The monarchy's center of gravity was slipping. Royal authority, once assumed as a divine right, was now openly challenged by private armies and regional leagues. Catherine spent much of her time traveling between courts and strongholds, attempting to persuade reluctant nobles and skeptical clergy to remain loyal to the crown. Her presence at these negotiations still carried weight, but less than it once had. She was in her mid-50s, her health beginning to falter, and the network she had spent decades cultivating was slowly unraveling under the pressure of national crisis. Her relationship with Henry III was also complicated. He was devoted to her emotionally, but often disregarded her political advice. His court became known for its decadence, dominated by his personal favorites, the Minois, whose lavish dress, open favoritism, and lack of political acumen drew widespread criticism. Many viewed them as corrupting influences, and Catherine's inability to moderate her son's excesses added to her political liability. Still, Catherine remained active. She continued to correspond with foreign courts, especially Spain and the papacy, hoping to secure alliances or at least neutrality in France's worsening domestic conflict. She proposed a series of religious conferences and once again promoted interfaith marriage as a means of reconciliation. But by the 1580s, even she began to realize that moderation could no longer hold. The Catholic League had grown more militant, openly defying royal authority and establishing parallel systems of governance in League-held cities. One of the most dangerous flashpoints came in 1584 when the king's brother François, Duke of Anjou, died without an heir. This made Henry of Navarre, still a Protestant, the legal successor to the French crown. For the Catholic League and many conservative Catholics, the idea of a Huguenot king was intolerable. The League, with Spanish backing, declared war on Navarre's claim and began mobilizing for conflict. Catherine, alarmed by the situation, attempted to persuade Henry of Navarre to return to Catholicism, but her appeals were rebuffed. He had seen too much duplicity in the crown's past dealings to trust such overtures. Catherine's health deteriorated during these years. She suffered from severe arthritis and recurring fevers, which at times made it difficult for her to travel or hold court. Still, she pressed on, attending council meetings, corresponding with governors, and even organizing military logistics when necessary. Her stamina surprised many. Even her enemies grudgingly acknowledged her resilience. But her political instincts, once so sharp, were beginning to dull under the weight of fatigue and the rapidly shifting political order. The 1588 Day of the Barricades marked another turning point. In Paris, the Catholic League staged an uprising against Henry III, forcing him to flee the capital. The event deeply shook both king and queen mother. For the first time, it was clear that the monarchy no longer held control over the capital city. Catherine, now nearly 70, worked desperately to contain the fallout. She met with League leaders, including the powerful Duke of Guise, and tried to negotiate a truce, But her words held little sway. The League viewed her as an artifact of a failed political order, a woman who had tried for too long to manage irreconcilable factions. Henry III pushed beyond his limits, struck back with a drastic decision. In December 1588, he ordered the assassination of the Duke of Guise and his brother at the Château de Blois. It was a shocking move, one that Catherine had reportedly opposed. The murders eliminated the immediate threat of the Guise brothers, but they also shattered any remaining pretense of negotiation. The Catholic League declared open rebellion. France was now deep into what many historians call the War of the Three Henrys, a three-way struggle between Henry III, Henry of Navarre, and the ultra-Catholic League led by the Guise faction. Catherine was devastated by the killings at Blois. Though she had supported harsh measures in the past, she believed the assassinations would only deepen the cycle of violence. Her authority at court, already weakened by age and illness, eroded further. She spent her final months attempting to prevent full-scale collapse. But her influence, once central, had become largely symbolic. Even her son, now desperate and cornered, began to act more independently, no longer seeking her counsel with the same deference. As 1588 turned into 1589, Catherine could sense the end approaching. France was in chaos. Royal forces were retreating in multiple provinces, the League controlled Paris, and the specter of foreign intervention loomed large. Catherine's vision of a united France under a strong Valois monarchy was in ruins. Her political life had been spent trying to balance extremes to hold power not through ideology but through calculation. That strategy had worked for decades, but it could not outlast the radicalized forces that now dominated French politics. She was dying in a kingdom that no longer believed in compromise, and in a court that no longer truly listened to her. By the final months of 1588, Catherine de Medici's health was in sharp decline. Decades of relentless travel negotiation and crisis management had taken their toll. Her hands were crippled by arthritis, her strength waning from bouts of fever and digestive problems, likely worsened by the stress and dietary constraints of near-constant court mobility. And yet, even in this debilitated state, she remained politically active, issuing instructions, advising her son Henry III, and corresponding with nobles and foreign powers. But her ability to influence the course of events was rapidly diminishing. The political landscape had become unrecognizable from the one she had sought to govern. In her prime, Catherine had held together a fragile kingdom through the force of her pragmatism and unrelenting activity. Now, France was disintegrating into what looked increasingly like a failed state. The Guise faction, enraged by the December assassinations ordered by Henry III, had declared open rebellion. Paris was no longer in royal hands. The League governed large parts of the country. Catherine's previous balancing strategy, negotiating between factions, had lost all traction. Adding to her despair was the realization that her children, for whom she had fought and governed, were dying one by one. Francis II had died in 1560. Charles IX, her second son, had passed away in 1574 after years of physical and psychological deterioration. Her youngest son, Henry III, remained on the throne, but his power was largely symbolic. He was detested by Catholic hardliners, mistrusted by Protestants, and isolated within his own court. Once again, Catherine was forced to confront the same grim reality that had defined her adult life. The monarchy was at risk of total collapse. Her personal losses were staggering. Of her 10 children, only 3 had outlived her by the time of her death. Her daughters had been used as pawns in diplomatic marriages. Her sons had either died young or ruled as deeply troubled monarchs. Her role as mother, so central to her identity and political approach, had delivered no lasting legacy beyond a series of failed heirs and shattered alliances. She had preserved the throne for nearly 30 years through extraordinary effort, but now that throne teetered on the edge of irrelevance. Even her relationship with Henry III, once marked by deep interdependence, became strained in her final year. Though Henry remained affectionate toward her, he increasingly made decisions without her advice, most notably the decision to execute the Duke of Guise, which Catherine had reportedly tried to prevent. She understood better than most that such actions, once taken, foreclosed diplomacy and provoked all-out retaliation. Her frustration was less emotional than strategic. She knew that the king had, by killing Guise, eliminated one threat only to empower others, pushing France into an unwinnable war. Catherine spent her final weeks at Château de Blois, where the royal court had temporarily relocated after the Day of the Barricades. There, she tried to stabilize the collapsing monarchy one last time. She wrote letters to Catholic nobles urging restraint and to Protestant leaders warning against exploitation of the crisis. She attempted to secure funds to pay royal troops and advised Henry on negotiating a truce with Henry of Navarre. But her words fell increasingly on deaf ears. She was also aware of the grim practicalities of her situation. Her family's reputation had become synonymous with betrayal, bloodshed, and decadence. Among Protestants, she was remembered primarily as the orchestrator, or at least enabler, of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Among hardline Catholics, she was seen as too lenient a failed queen, who had compromised with heretics and undermined the cause of faith. Even the moderate politiques, once her natural allies, had largely abandoned the monarchy, seeing it as incapable of restoring order. In this climate, Catherine was increasingly treated as a symbol of the old order, formidable but obsolete. Her presence at court no longer inspired fear or respect, only unease. Visitors noted her diminished physical state and occasional incoherence. She was often bedridden, reliant on attendants to manage correspondence. Though her mind remained sharp in moments, her body betrayed her more each day. She knew the end was near. According to contemporary accounts, Catherine died on January 5, 1589, after a prolonged illness, possibly from pleurisy or an intestinal infection. She was 69 years old. Her death received little ceremony. France was too fractured to afford a proper royal funeral. The Catholic League refused to permit her body to be buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis beside her husband Henry II. She was instead interred temporarily at Blois. Years later, during a lull in the wars of religion, her remains were finally moved to Saint-Denis, but by then her memory had already been permanently stained. Catherine's death marked the end of the Valois dynasty's matriarchal power. Though Henry III still nominally ruled, he was politically isolated, militarily weakened, and spiritually shaken. Within 8 months of his mother's death, he would be assassinated by a fanatical monk. With his death, the Valois line ended, and the throne passed to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant who would become King Henry IV after converting to Catholicism. Catherine de Medici, who had spent decades trying to prevent precisely this outcome, died just before it occurred. Her life's work had been to preserve her family's claim to the throne, to prevent a Protestant king, and to hold France together through compromise and calculated force. In all three aims, she ultimately failed. The long arc of her career, marked by tactical brilliance and moral ambiguity, came to a close in quiet defeat. Her last days were not defined by grand pronouncements or vindication, but by physical decay, political irrelevance, and the dissolution of everything she had spent a lifetime constructing. For a woman once feared as the most powerful figure in France, the end was not just tragic, it was terrifying in its total erasure of meaning. The court she had dominated moved on without her. The kingdom she had preserved collapsed anyway. The sons she had fought for were gone, and the memory of her long before she was in the ground had already begun to curdle into myth. Following Catherine de Medici's death in January 1589, France was thrust further into disarray. With the Queen Mother gone, the monarchy was deprived not only of its last experienced political manager, but also of a figure whose presence, however contested, had served as a kind of stabilizing constant for nearly 3 decades. Her son Henry III, now without his closest advisor, stood alone against a deeply fragmented realm, unable to prevent the unraveling that his mother had so long delayed. The vacuum Catherine left behind was quickly filled not by new leadership, but by intensifying chaos. The Catholic League, already in open rebellion, viewed her death as one less obstacle to its goal of purging heresy and installing a king aligned with their ultra-Catholic ideology. Henry III, viewed with contempt by both the League and many of his own subjects, lacked both the military strength and political capital to resist them effectively. He had inherited his mother's instinct for courtly gamesmanship, but lacked her patience, her vast network, and her ability to pivot between enemies. Even in death, Catherine remained a figure of controversy. Her funeral, postponed due to political instability, did not take place in Paris or in the Basilica of French Kings. Instead, she was buried in the chapel at Château de Blois with minimal ceremony. The political climate rendered a proper state funeral impossible, and her legacy was so toxic to many factions that even her burial became a matter of dispute. Only much later, after a fragile peace allowed for brief stability, were her remains transferred to Saint-Denis. By then, public memory had hardened. Catherine was no longer seen as a queen regent or a matriarch, but as an architect of France's suffering. This reputation was shaped not only by contemporary accounts, but also by the immediate actions that followed her death. Just 7 months later, in August 1589, Henry III himself was assassinated by Jacques Clément, a radical Catholic monk who believed he was ridding France of a traitor. The killing was emblematic of the fanatical political climate Catherine had tried for so long to contain. Her death, followed by her sons, marked the extinction of the Valois line, a dynasty that had ruled France for over 2 centuries. In the absence of a clear Catholic successor, the crown passed controversially to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant and leader of the Huguenots. His claim was indisputable by blood, but unacceptable to the Catholic League. France now found itself with a Protestant king at war with half of his own country. Navarre's military campaign to secure the throne would drag on for years. To finally secure power, he would famously convert to Catholicism in 1593, reportedly remarking that Paris is well worth a mass. It was a decision rooted in the same cold pragmatism that had defined Catherine's political style. Catherine's legacy, however, did not benefit from this shift toward compromise. While Henry IV's conversion helped heal the kingdom, it also reinforced the perception that Catherine's balancing act, her efforts to reconcile the faiths, had been too little too late. She had prevented outright collapse, but at the cost of deepening mistrust and cementing factional hostility. The political tools she had used, arranged marriages, assassinations, religious edicts, and manipulative diplomacy, came to be seen not as clever statecraft, but as cynical machinations that prolonged suffering. Her reputation declined rapidly in both Catholic and Protestant narratives. For Protestants, she was the Jezebel of France, the alleged mastermind of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a foreign queen who had brought Italian poison and deceit into French politics. For Catholics, particularly the League, she was a compromiser who had betrayed the true faith by tolerating heretics and failing to crush dissent. The absence of a faction willing to claim her ensured that she would be vilified across the spectrum. By the early 17th century, Catherine had become a central figure in polemical literature. Rumors and fabrications proliferated accusations that she had used black magic, that she kept astrologers and necromancers in her court, that she had poisoned political opponents with Italian techniques unknown to the French. These tales, though largely unfounded, fit the public mood. They gave a name and a face to decades of war and fear. In Catherine de Medici, France found a scapegoat. Perhaps the most damaging legacy was how she became emblematic of the dangers of female rule. Though she had governed effectively in a time of crisis, her gender was often cited as evidence that such power in the hands of a woman could only lead to chaos. This misogynistic reading was amplified by her Italian origin, framing her not only as unnatural in authority, but as an alien element in the French body politic. In both visual art and literature, she was portrayed as calculating, cold, and manipulative, a narrative that would endure for centuries. Her children's legacies fared no better. Charles IX was remembered as weak and traumatized, Henry III as effeminate and disconnected from reality, Margaret of Valois as scandalous and politically ineffectual. Even those who tried to rehabilitate Catherine's image in later years struggled against the mountain of damning accounts already embedded in the public consciousness. Yet, despite this, Catherine's contributions to statecraft cannot be dismissed. She navigated one of the most volatile periods in French history with remarkable endurance. She held power across 4 reigns, first as consort, then as regent, and finally as senior advisor. She prevented France from falling into complete dissolution during the early stages of the Wars of Religion, and delayed civil collapse through methods that, however ruthless, were often the only options available. Historians in the 20th and 21st centuries have revisited her life with a more critical and nuanced lens. While her complicity in atrocities like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remains undeniable, many now recognize the extraordinary constraints she operated under a female foreigner in a patriarchal court, managing a country divided by religious war and noble ambition. Her pragmatism, rather than malevolence, is increasingly viewed as the animating force of her rule. Still, the terror of her final months, the political isolation, the bodily decay, the irreversible collapse of the dynasty she had spent her life defending, offers a grim coda to her career. Catherine de Medici did not die in disgrace, but she died in defeat. and in the years that followed, her enemies ensured that her name would carry more fear than admiration. The years immediately following Catherine de Medici's death saw her legacy hardened not by reflective reassessment, but by the rapid mythologization of her role in one of Europe's most violent and unstable periods. For those who lived through the wars of religion, the question of blame was ever present, and Catherine, with her long tenure, foreign birth, and Machiavellian image, became an ideal candidate. The printed pamphlets of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, especially in Protestant regions like England and the Dutch Republic, were unrelenting in their depictions. They portrayed Catherine as a puppet master, a poisoner, a black widow of the Valois court. Illustrations showed her surrounded by skulls and serpents, whispering in the ears of kings or mixing poisons in secret chambers. While these images were hyperbolic and fictionalized, they found a ready audience in war-weary populations looking for a villain. Even in France, the League's chroniclers, despite being Catholic, reviled her for her perceived leniency and tolerance. These caricatures fed into a broader European discourse that was already suspicious of female rulers. Catherine's memory became entangled with other notorious queens of the era, such as Mary the Wine of England and Isabella of Spain, women who were either celebrated or condemned, based largely on the outcomes of wars and religious agendas. In Catherine's case, the perception was especially negative because her strategies had failed to produce stability. The monarchy collapsed under her sons, her politics led to mass bloodshed, and her final years were marked by sickness, obscurity, and loss. But the truth of her final days is more chilling than her myth. Unlike monarchs who died in triumph or with their reputations intact, Catherine died witnessing the total collapse of the political order she had fought to preserve. Her health had declined steadily, but it was not a dramatic singular illness that brought her down. It was a drawn-out weakening of both body and influence. For a woman accustomed to command to being the last word in court strategy, this erosion of agency was its own form of torment. She spent her final months largely confined to her rooms at Blois, where she was visited less and less frequently. The court, now consumed by fear and divided loyalty, moved around her without the same deference. Those who had once sought her favor now distanced themselves, wary of association with a queen mother whose political vision had failed. She was attended by a shrinking circle of loyal retainers, some clergy, some Italian courtiers, a few remaining household officials. Most of her correspondence in her last months consisted of unanswered letters, appeals to nobles and church officials to support Henry III against the Catholic League. What makes her final days especially grim is how she was aware of her own growing irrelevance. Catherine had built her political career on adaptability, on shifting between factions, buying time, and leveraging dynastic alliances. But by 1589, none of those strategies were viable. The factions had radicalized, time had run out, and the dynasty she had dedicated her life to sustaining was poised to vanish with her last son. In the solitude of her chambers, she would have known what her death meant, that the entire Valois line was collapsing, not with a dramatic usurpation or conquest, but with exhaustion. There were also material indignities. Unlike the well-orchestrated deaths of earlier monarchs, with carefully planned funerals and grand displays of state mourning, Catherine's death occasioned no such ceremony. France was too divided to pause for mourning. Royal finances were too depleted to afford spectacle, and public sympathy was nowhere to be found. Instead, her death was met with a muted reaction. Some League supporters even celebrated it, interpreting it as divine justice. The lack of a proper funeral added to the impression that her death was not a conclusion, but an erasure. She was not buried beside her husband immediately. There was no elaborate procession through Paris. Instead, her body remained at Blois until it could be moved years later. That delay, symbolic in itself, reflected how her role in history had become inconvenient. She had once been the central force of the monarchy. Now she was a political liability, even in death. Perhaps most disturbingly, there were rumors that her corpse was desecrated during the later wars, a common fate for those deemed tyrants or enemies of faith during moments of ideological extremism. While no reliable source confirms this definitively, the very plausibility of such an act, especially given the fate of other royal tombs at Saint-Denis during the French Revolution, a century later speaks to how deep the animosity ran. And yet, while public perception turned against her, Catherine's influence was not entirely lost. Her administrative reforms, particularly those involving royal finances, court protocol, and regional governance, laid foundations that would later be consolidated under Henry IV and eventually Louis XIV. Her insistence on central authority over noble autonomy, even if often circumvented, foreshadowed the rise of absolutist models that would come to define the Bourbon monarchy. Historians today wrestle with her contradictions. She was both a preserver and a destroyer of order. She championed compromise but enabled violence. She acted out of maternal devotion but was willing to sacrifice others to protect her children's reigns. She embodied the complexities of rule in a time when France was tearing itself apart and no idealism could survive. Her death, more than the deaths of her sons, symbolized the final unraveling of the Valois dynasty. With her passing, the last competent, if controversial figure capable of navigating the chaos was gone. The monarchy fell into the hands of Henry III, who would not survive the year. The wars of religion would rage on until 1598, when Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes. But by then, Catherine de Medici was long dead remembered, not for the peace she tried to forge, but for the horrors she failed to prevent. Her legacy was not sealed by a great downfall or a public disgrace, but by quiet political extinction. And in that her end may have been more terrifying than any public execution or battlefield loss, because it was the slow, conscious witnessing of everything she had built slipping irretrievably away. In the decades that followed Catherine de Medici's death, her reputation deteriorated even further, shaped not by balanced historical assessment, but by political necessity, religious animosity, and public fear. The vacuum left by her passing allowed her detractors, Protestants, Catholic radicals, misogynists, and political opportunists, to recast her not as a monarch navigating crisis, but as a villainous figure who had orchestrated decades of suffering for personal and dynastic gain. This transformation into legend was accelerated by the enduring trauma of the French Wars of Religion. For generations, French society bore the scars of massacres, sieges, famine, and betrayal. The Valois dynasty had collapsed in disgrace, and while Henry IV of the Bourbon line eventually restored some measure of order, the cultural and psychological wounds lingered. Catherine, whose life had intersected every major development of the conflict, became an irresistible symbol her image distilled into everything the new order wished to forget or condemn. Writers and pamphleteers amplified the most lurid aspects of her life. Allegations of poisonings proliferated, many based on thin evidence or hearsay. Stories emerged of secret apothecaries, hidden torture chambers, and fatal elixirs administered at her behest. Even events she likely had no direct role in, such as the deaths of various court rivals, were retroactively attributed to her supposed machinations. These narratives were not confined to underground texts. They found their way into plays, sermons, and political rhetoric across Europe. In England, Elizabethan dramatists and pamphlet authors held her up as a cautionary figure, a foreign queen, steeped in deceit whose interference had brought ruin upon France. Protestant writers painted her as the antitype to their own monarch, Elizabeth I. In Catholic Spain, too, Catherine was viewed with distrust for her tolerance toward Huguenots. She became the rare figure loathed by both religious camps, a testament to how thoroughly she had operated in the gray zones of ideology and power. This dark image persisted into the Enlightenment, when philosophers and historians alike took up the task of explaining the failures of absolutism and the causes of religious intolerance. Catherine, though a transitional figure rather than an absolute monarch, became associated with the failures of both systems. Her reputation was a casualty not only of her own decisions, but of the narratives needed by later generations to explain and moralize a complex past. And yet, despite centuries of vilification, the record remains more nuanced. Catherine's governance was marked not by bloodlust or unchecked ambition, but by a desperate attempt to hold together a collapsing state. Her policies were reactive, shaped by necessity more than ideology. She did not create the sectarian crisis that consumed France. She inherited it and then struggled often unsuccessfully to contain it. She had seen the limitations of royal power firsthand. From her early years in Florence, taken hostage during political revolts, to her decades in the French court, she had learned that thrones were rarely secure and that the appearance of stability was often more important than its reality. Her rule reflected this worldview, flexible, opportunistic, and grounded in the idea that survival itself was a victory. In more recent historiography, scholars have taken a revisionist approach, scrutinizing the context in which she ruled. They note that few rulers, male or female, could have achieved more with the tools available to her. Her efforts to bridge Catholic and Protestant divides, while ultimately unsuccessful, were far ahead of their time. Her preference for diplomacy over extermination was not weakness, but a recognition of France's complex social fabric. Her reliance on secret correspondence and intelligence gathering was a necessity in a political environment defined by conspiracy and shifting alliances. Her use of marriage diplomacy, while often criticized as cynical, was one of the few levers available to her in a world where female power remained constrained by gender expectations and legal limitations. In that regard, she played the role assigned to her with more strategic clarity than most male rulers of the time. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Catherine's legacy is how little she could ultimately preserve. Her entire political life was oriented toward the preservation of the Valois dynasty, and yet within 7 months of her death that dynasty had vanished. Her son Henry III was assassinated. Her daughters were scattered or disgraced. The Catholic League rejected her authority, the Protestants reviled her memory, and the very idea of monarchy was in question. She did not die a martyr or a tyrant. She died a witness to failure to dissolution and to the profound limits of human control. The silence that followed her death was not the hush of reverence, but the absence of mourning. No public elegies, no memorials, no royal tributes. Only her body unburied for months and her name soon spoken only in whispers or curses. In the centuries to come, few queens would wield the power she did, and fewer still would be judged so harshly. Catherine de Medici's death was not merely physical. It was the symbolic end of a political experiment. The idea that moderation, cunning, and maternal stewardship could hold back the tide of ideological extremism and dynastic decay. That experiment failed not because she lacked skill or resolve, but because the age she inhabited devoured all who dared to mediate its fury. Her death then was not terrifying for how it occurred, but for what it represented: the full unraveling of a world she had spent a lifetime trying to hold together alone. Catherine de Medici's life is one of Europe's most complex political sagas, marked by longevity, adaptability, and tragedy. She ruled not with armies or manifestos, but through negotiation, compromise, and calculated manipulation. Her efforts to preserve the Valois monarchy amid civil war, religious fanaticism, and dynastic uncertainty demanded extraordinary political agility. Yet her legacy remains haunted by the events she could not prevent. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the slow implosion of royal authority, and the extinction of her line have obscured her administrative skill and political resilience. Misrepresented as a poisoner, she became a stand-in for the collective trauma of an era defined by betrayal, fanaticism, and fear. Today, historians are rediscovering the woman behind the myth, an Italian queen, in a hostile French court, a mother burdened with impossible decisions, and a ruler whose worst sin may have been believing she could outmaneuver history itself. Her death was not theatrical, but it was in its silent symbolism far more terrifying. It marked not just the end of a queen, but the failure of a dynasty, a vision, and an entire mode of power.